She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I am here today with a pretty incredible Indian broad for us to talk about. But before I dig into her, I feel guilty, like I owe you guys like an explanation. Longtime listeners of the podcast, I'm sure sometimes you notice that I replay old episodes of the podcast, and that I have done the last 3 weeks, which is more than I usually do it. And I guess I just wanted to tell you why, because I feel like I've never explained that. But now that Chloe and Sam have been gone and I'm producing the podcast by myself and hosting it by myself, it is a little bit harder to book guests in advance, and it's harder to do all the research by myself. And sometimes when I have a crazy busy work week, or if I'm out of town or something and I am not able to squeeze it in before I go, I just don't have the space to do a great research job and get it done for you guys. So when that happens, I will go back and replay an older episode, because a lot of times people haven't heard them all anyway, and it's a good chance to revisit some of those oldies. But this particular work cycle has been absolutely batshit crazy, and now it's been 3 weeks, and I had this broad researched actually for last week, but only half researched and could not finish it in time and was so tired, and I went to bed. And then, of course, the second half of this check-in is just to tell you, I know right now I have a little bit of a lisp, and it's because I'm wearing my retainer, because of all things to happen today, apparently I chipped my tooth on a sandwich, which apparently you can do that, when you're, I don't know, getting older like me, you're not 20 anymore, and I am wearing my retainer because I feel better until I can get to the dentist and have them look at it. I don't want to make it any worse by accident. So I have a little bit of a lisp, but I'm here anyway, and I am so excited to share this broad with you today. Okay, so I mentioned that she's an Indian broad. And we have covered a few Indian broads on the podcast so far, including, you might remember, Shakuntala Devi, the human computer, Kadambini Ganguly, who was the first female doctor in India, Rani Lakshmi Bai, the revolutionary hero, and Sampat Paul Devi and her Gulabi gang. Literally, they are saving women by beating down their abusers. This is happening today, very recent history. And today's broad is no less amazing in all that she did, and specifically all that she did for the women of India. However, much like another Indian broad we covered, Indira Gandhi, we covered that was way back at the very beginning of the podcast. I think that was Sam's episode. Much like Indira, this broad is also very controversial. So, who am I talking about? Her name is Cornelia Sorabji. I can hear your crickets. Who is Cornelia Sorabji? You haven't heard her name, right? She was the first female graduate from Bombay University, the first woman to study law at Oxford University, not the first Indian woman, the first woman to study law at Oxford, and the first female quote, advocate in India. She was not actually allowed to be a full-on lawyer till the friggin' law changed in 1923, but she still practiced a long and pretty successful career, especially given how upstream she was swimming in the misogyny of the systems she lived in. But why haven't you heard of her? Because those are amazing accomplishments, right, for a woman of that time period. And it's her controversy that more or less ended up kind of erasing her from history a little bit. And I'll talk more specifically in detail about the controversy part towards the end, but Cornelia essentially picked the, quote, other side in the Indian independence movement. She believed in the British Empire wholeheartedly, and she went really hard for it. So she actually advocated against Gandhi himself. Y'all, not Indira Gandhi, but Gandhi. And as you probably know, that viewpoint did not, win in the political arena. That was kind of the losing side, or the wrong side of history. So Cornelia's story and all of her accomplishments were more or less buried once India got its independence from the British Empire. Now, I don't usually tell the end of the broad story at the beginning of the episode, but I feel like in Cornelia's case, I actually think it provides an interesting opportunity to explore the why of her story, and why would a woman who would end up fighting so hard for severely underrepresented women in her entire life, why would she lean so hard into the British Empire and against her own people, right? So let's dig into her story and find out. Cornelia was born in 1866 in Nashik, which is near Bombay. And Cornelia was one of 10 children. Always impressive, 10 children. And she was named after her adoptive grandmother, Lady Cornelia Maria Darling Ford. And as you can guess, she was a British woman. Her daddy was a reverend and a Christian missionary, and apparently also a feminist, because he had supposedly been a key figure in convincing Bombay University to admit women to its degree programs. And Cornelia's mom, on the other hand, had been adopted at the age of 12 and brought up by a British couple and this particular couple also were very active, establishing several girls' schools in Pune. Now that city is called Pune or Pune, I'm not sure. So right from the get-go of Cornelia's story, we can see that not only was she heavily influenced by literally having grandparents that were British, but we also see from the beginning a very strong advocacy for women's education from both sides of her family, which is pretty cool. Like, having a huge legacy of advocacy for women at a time when it was really not cool to support women's rights, I think that's kind of awesome and very unusual in many of the broads we've covered. I always think it's a little helpful for us to give a little more context about what was happening at this time period during Cornelia's childhood and in her lifetime. Obviously, India has a very long and very rich history. I'm only giving you a super small snapshot. But at this time period, we are nearing the end of British colonial rule in India. And it happens at the end of Cornelia's life, actually. Independence is gained in 1947. And women's rights at the time Cornelia is born are still, though, pretty dismal. Advocates like her parents were gaining more and more ground, getting women admitted to universities, etc. And sati had already been abolished in 1829. So you might recall from our previous episodes, we talked about that old Hindu practice of sati. This is the practice when a husband died, their widows would basically sacrifice themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. So that particular practice had already been outlawed at the time Cornelia was born. So there was like some progress, but not a ton of progress. And I already mentioned a previous broad, Kadambini Ganguly. She was the first female doctor in India. She graduated in 1883 and began her medical training around 1886. And at that time, when she was doing that, Cornelia was like 18, 20 years old. She was this bright, shining young woman and only very slightly younger than Kadambini. So they're sort of contemporaries, really. They are contemporaries. That's just a couple years apart. But despite all of these kind of markers of progress that we're seeing with Kadambini, with the laws slowly changing, child marriage would not be outlawed until 1929. And even when it was outlawed, the legal age for marriage was set at 14 for a really, really long time after that. So Cornelia is like still, she is living in a time that's still kind of the trench warfare of women's rights in India. And Cornelia would end up becoming kind of a figurehead for women's progress in the justice system, the way Kanambini was for women in medicine, right? So as a girl, back to Cornelia's story, she got both an amazing homeschool education from her very education-minded family, and she also had a mission school education. So she ends up, as she grows older, she enrolls in Deccan College, and she is the first woman to do so. And she receives the top grades in her final exams of everybody in her class, which at that time should have entitled her to a government scholarship to continue her studies in England. But, and this is by her own description in her writing, Cornelia is denied that scholarship because she is a woman, of course. And so she ends up instead getting a temporary teaching job, teaching English at Gujarat College. And she continues her own education kind of at the same time while she's, paying the rent. And in 1888, she becomes the first female graduate of Bombay University. And she has a first-class degree in literature at this time. And then she writes in to the National Indian Association for assistance in completing her education in Britain. She's still trying to get to Britain. She wants a British education. She was raised British. She knows the value of it at the time, right? And she wants to get there, and she wants to do that pathway. And she ends up, her cause, her petition for further education in Britain ends up getting picked up by a couple really prominent British figures, including Mary Hobhouse, whose husband Arthur was a member of the Council of India, and Adelaide Manning, and I think you guys will like this, especially long-term listeners, another one of our own broads even contributed financially to her cause, and that was Florence Nightingale. I can never get over the discovery that two broads that we're covering on the podcast literally intersected in real time in their lives. Isn't that just always amazing? I love it. So Cornelia is able to successfully petition and raise the funds, and she arrives in England in 1889. And she ends up staying with Manning and Hobhouse, and she begins classes to become the first woman to study law at Oxford. Not just the first Indian woman, like I said, the first woman to study at Oxford. And she is also the first woman to be admitted as a reader to the Codrington Library of All Souls College in Oxford in 1890. So you heard that correctly. Before her time, it was a men's only library. So this is in Britain. So lest we forget, the rest of the world was also extremely sexist. It wasn't just India. And so she is given permission, and she's allowed to study in the library and check out books, etc., etc. In 1892, she is given special permission by congregational decree, and mostly because of all these petitions of her kind of prominent, wealthy British friends. She petitions and is allowed to take the postgraduate Bachelor of Civil Law exam at Somerville College in Oxford. And she is the first woman ever to do so. And even though she passes the exam, of course she passes the exam, she is not actually awarded a degree because Oxford did not award women degrees at this time period. She would eventually, fast forward, she would eventually get her degree after World War I, when Oxford started allowing women to earn degrees. And so, for those of you who don't know time and history very well, World War I ended in 1918. That's 106 years ago from today, right? Oxford still wasn't letting women get degrees. Anyway, I'm digressing. But in 1893, she returns to India, and she becomes the first woman in the British Empire, not just India, the whole British Empire, to plead before a British judge when she successfully defends an accused person charged with murder. But when she applies for submission to plead in the Allahabad High Court, she's refused because of a woman. And she kind of continuously applies to become more official and be allowed to plead really publicly, and she's continuously denied. In 1897, Cornelia presents herself for the LLB exam at Bombay University. And LLB, I had to look it up since I, am not a lawyer and don't know these things. That is Latin for Legum Baccalaureus, which is basically a Bachelor of Law. And then she also takes the pleader's examination for the Allahabad High Court in 1899. And she will become the first female advocate in India. But that is not quite the same as being a lawyer, or a barrister is the word they use in Britain. She wasn't made a full-on lawyer until the law which barred women from practicing was changed, fast forward, in 1923. If you're watching on YouTube, you could see like my 5 million eye rolls as I talk about all of these laws preventing women from practicing law. Dial it back, that was a little fast forward. In 1901, Cornelia travels back to Britain, and she's got a new plan. She keeps running into all these troubles. She can't practice the way she wants to in India. She goes back to Britain, and she lobbies for this unique appointment in a position as, quote, lady assistant to the Court of Wards. And this is an official position within the British administration in the northern part of India, where she mostly practiced. And it's kind of at this point in her life where she becomes heavily involved in both social work and law advisory work on behalf of the Purdahnashins. And the Purdahnashins are women who are forbidden to communicate with males in the outside world. And in many of these cases, these women actually owned like considerable property, oftentimes through being widowed and that sort of thing. But other male family members were not allowing them to access it, or trying to kind of usurp the money, the prominence for themselves. And all of these women were not allowed to talk to women, so they weren't allowed to access lawyers to help them. They couldn't hire a male lawyer because they weren't allowed to talk to men, right? But Cornelia wasn't officially a, quote, lawyer because of all those archaic laws, but she did have all of the legal knowledge. She went to school. She had everything basically but permission in the degrees. And since she now had this official appointment as lady assistant to the Court of Wards, she was able to enter pleas on these women's behalf before the British agents. And so in 1904, she got the appointment also for some additional regions: Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. I'm probably saying all these Indian words wrong. I'm so sorry. And also Assam. And despite all these fucking limitations that we've been talking through, Cornelia was basically able to kind of carve out this like niche legal practice serving the Purdahnashins. And no doubt, because she partially was taking cases her male counterparts could not take, but still, she really persisted. And I find this totally amazing, right? And this is not, I should also say, this is not to say her cases were not, like, easy cases. They're not, like, low-hanging fruit, even though the men couldn't try them. That was because the women couldn't talk to the men. Her cases actually required a huge amount of expertise in both Muslim and Hindu property law, and this like really tough negotiation skill was required, because she was essentially putting together arguments to protect her Purdahnashin clients who were totally defenseless in the face of the patriarchy and all these rules they had to live by. She was kind of like their lone hero in a way. And she was really busy at this. She was really good, and she was really busy. She kept very meticulous annual reports of all the work she did and all of her accomplishments. In 1916 alone, she reported that she provided legal assistance to 110 estates and represented 176 women, 139 boys, and 95 girls. And she had traveled more than 20,000 miles by rail and road and water. That's all in 1 year, the span of 1 year. In 20 years of service in this position, it's estimated that she helped over 600 women and orphans fight their legal battles. 600! Incredible! And sometimes she also didn't even charge for her services. She was a true advocate for these more or less legally helpless people. Now, at the same time, as she's doing her niche practice here, she was a pretty vocal advocate for social reforms. She was involved with the National Council for Women in India, the Federation of University Women, and the Bengal League of Social Service for Women. And in 1909, she was awarded the Kaisar-i-Hind, gold medal for her services to the Indian nation. But from the get-go, like, even when she is doing all this advocacy work and pretty well, she kind of opposed the imposition of Western perspective on the women's movement of India. She was, like, really cautious about social reforms, and she did not like the very rapid reforms that were trying to be pushed through. She kind of took this stance that she believed that education was going to be the key, and that once all the women were educated, or until the women were educated, political reform was not going to ever be kind of lasting in the country. And she also, from the get-go, supported the British Raj and Purdah, and she opposed Indian self-rule. That was kind of from the beginning. So that's, throughout their law career, she kind of took those viewpoints. Now, in 1922, Cornelia would officially retire from her position as appointed by the British courts. And nobody was ever actually appointed in her wake to replace her. But why did she retire? Because she wasn't done. She was still relatively young. So after the enactment of the Sex Disqualification Removal Act in 1919, Cornelia, this is when she was finally admitted as a vakil, maybe, which is basically a pleader in the court in India. And then in 1923, she's 55 years old at this point. She had completed studies at Lincoln's Inn, which is a prominent law school, and she is finally called to the bar in Britain. And she is the second Indian woman. There was another woman, Mithan Tata Lam, who was admitted just a few months before her. So at 55, after she's already been practicing, her own niche for a long time, she finally is admitted to the bar and allowed to legally practice. And this is partially because in 1923, the Legal Practitioners Women Act was passed. So she leaves that official British position and opens her own practice in Calcutta. And she still continues to advise and represent the Purdahnashin and her other clients that she had been building her whole career. But she still faced, even though technically the law had changed, she still faced a lot of bullshit challenges. And she would hear things all the time like, no woman can know the law, quote, end quote. And she was really isolated. She was one of the only women in her field doing this. And she continued forward, even despite the fact that all these lame changes were barriers were still in her way, even though she had, been admitted to the bar. She also would begin publishing. She didn't just do law, she also published 9 books, 2 specifically about the Purdahnashin, one called Purdahnashin, Love and Life, Behind the Purdah, and the Purdahnashin is the other title of that. And as always, she never stopped with her advocacy and her social reforms. But at this point in her life, now that she's past the bar doing all this other stuff, her viewpoints in social reform begin to harden even more, and they get a little bit more extreme and more controversial. So her pro-British viewpoints begin to really grow as Gandhi's nationalist movement gains momentum, and she becomes more and more vocal about her opposition to the nationalist movement and being against Indian independence from British rule. And by the late 1920s, she's like super, super vocal. And she's actively involved at this point in promoting support for the British Empire and preserving the rule of the British Raj. And there were some other books at this time period. Catherine Mayo's book, Mother India, which was published in 1927. She was a huge fan of that because that book was basically an attack on Indian self-rule. And she straight up publicly condemned Mahatma Gandhi's campaign of civil disobedience, which, as you all remember, if you even, watch American cinema and saw the movie Gandhi, you know something about it, right? That was a big deal movement that basically led to independence, and she was staunchly against it. And she also took her views on tour. She didn't even just write about them. She took them on tour. She'd go into Canada and the United States critiquing Gandhi publicly. And she published her views in the Atlantic magazine in 1931. And all of her super vocal advocacy against Gandhi basically would end up kind of costing her the support for her other social reforms that she also backed. There was one project she was trying to get off the ground for the League of Infant Welfare, Maternity, and District Nursing, and it failed. People were like, we don't really want to touch you right now. You are too controversial. We can't support these causes that you are advocating for. And in the 1930s, the late 1930s, Cornelia would end up moving permanently to Britain. Shocker! I'm sure nobody saw that coming, right? And she would live through the bombing in London during World War II. And she would end up dying in London in 1954, which was just a few months before her 88th birthday. An incredible life. Incredible and controversial. One of her obituaries, there was a quote about her that said she had, quote, no peer among the women of India. And one of her biographers, who wrote about her later, would say that she had chosen, quote, the wrong direction at an important moment in Indian history, and had thus been repudiated by the currents of her time, which tends to withhold from her the status that is her due. And a little bit after her death, this woman, Helena Normanton, she credited Cornelia and her support for women's lawyers and her progress for women's lawyers at a debate at the Lincoln's Inn where she studied. And in 1919, at this debate, Cornelia apparently gave a speech so eloquent, quote, the victory that night and then the 1919 statute were due to her career and her advocacy. So even though she more or less was not, her successes did not really survive British Indian independence, she is widely known, especially in the legal field by women, to be the kind of driving force between all of those changes of law that happened around 1920 that allowed women to be admitted to the bar, that allowed them to do that. So that is her story. That is Cornelia Sorabji and her incredible life. And I think she's a really interesting figure. I find myself still really fascinated. Why would you dig in so hard? And I have to think, after we heard all this about her story, I have to think it comes down to, her love of her grandparents and her own personal knowledge. Not only the love of her grandparents, but all of those supporters that she had throughout her life that were British, that helped make her education in Britain happen, et cetera, et cetera. It must have just been this immovable spot for her. I don't know what else to say about it other than it's an interesting look. And whether or not, she should have been erased from history books and not lauded as loudly as her accomplishments truly were, is that, I don't know if that's the right thing. Like, we always in this podcast are railing against the writers of the history books for omitting people. And even though I, for one, did not support the British rule over India, I don't think that she should have been erased for that. And so I love these stories that make me think about these things and think about, like, what is the right thing and what is the wrong thing, and what is the job of history, and how can we tell a more fair history wherein people get the credit that they're due, even if their arguments and the things that they fought for turned out not to be kind of the winning side of history, right? And that is actually kind of what this podcast is all about, is righting the wrongs of history. So here we have it with Cornelia Sorabji's story, and I hope you enjoyed learning about her. To learn more about Cornelia Sorabji and see pictures of her and quotes from this episode, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, you can click on over to the About page and read more about me, my bio, photo, links to all my cool stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social yet? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know. And Twitter, I still call it Twitter, at BYSK Podcast. Please comment, like, subscribe, or better yet, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps new listeners to find us. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you're a fan, please spread the word, share an episode with your friends and family, leave us a review, subscribe on YouTube, do the comments, do it all. It really, really helps new listeners to find us. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sarah Gorski, and edited by Chloe Skye, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed this episode about Cornelia Sorabji, then I highly suggest you check out some of her other badass Indian broads, most of which I mentioned in this episode. Kadambini Ganguly, Shakuntala Devi, Indira Gandhi, another controversial one, and Rani Lakshmi Bai, and Sampat Pal Devi and her Gulabi gang. And we'll see you next week for another Broad You Should Know.